Hello, everybody, and welcome to our net neutrality discussion. I'm Jared. This is Gia, and we have some excellent experts here on net neutrality. If I have to leave in the middle, we're still in my committee meeting late at night here in Washington. The Educational Workforce Committee is marking up a bill. We just voted on about 15 different amendments. We'll be voting again in about an hour. Hopefully, we'll be finished by then. But I want to welcome everybody to our discussion on net neutrality. We'll be underway in about 1 minute. Welcome to our discussion of net neutrality. We just went live, and we will be beginning our discussion about what we can do and what's going on. And then we look forward to getting to your questions in just about 1 more minute. We have some top national and local Colorado experts on the impact of net neutrality that are with us today as guests. And this is your opportunity to ask them your questions about net neutrality, what's going on at the FCC, what the rule change would mean to you as a consumer, or perhaps to you as a small business. I'm Jared Polis. I want to welcome you to our live virtual digital roundtable about net neutrality, a very important topic. We're going to begin in just a minute, and I want to welcome all of you to our digital roundtable on net neutrality. I'm Jared Polis. I want to thank you all for joining us, and we're going to begin right now. Net neutrality, as you probably know, refers to a way to protect the openness of the internet and the way that content is treated equally by providers. It effectively would mean that those who control the pipelines of the internet, if you will, generally the cable companies, would not be able to use their market power to harm small businesses or consumers or internet users like hospitals or libraries, or discriminate based on content. The most dynamic aspect of the internet from a job creation perspective, from a consumer perspective, is on the content side. We obviously need access, and certainly those who invest on the access side deserve a reasonable return on investment to provide incentives to bring us faster and less expensive ways to access the internet. But they are not the internet, and they do not control the internet. The internet is a combination of every content provider, from a garage server to large international corporations. And to be able to discriminate based on the content is really counter to the whole ethos of the internet and will be damaging not only to small businesses and entrepreneurs, but also to consumers. I want to add that the points I'm making are widely agreed upon by certainly my constituents, as well as those who commented to the FCC. In fact, 66-1 was the ratio of comments supporting net neutrality. 67 comments for net neutrality, 1 against. There's also, of course, been a question about the provenance of some of those comments against neutrality, if they were against net neutrality, if they were even from real people. My office, and this is relatively unique, I represent a very diverse ideological congressional district from Larimer to Grant to Broomfield to Boulder County and beyond. On a typical issue like tax reform or the Affordable Care Act, I might get, emails and calls that are 50-50, or, for the Affordable Care Act, 60% saying keep it, 40% saying repeal. But, a lot of context on both sides. For net neutrality, I've gotten just over 1,500 calls and over 5,700 emails. Every single one was for net neutrality and against Chairman Pai's reversal of net neutrality. I've never been representative on an issue where all my constituents who contacted me have agreed. I mean, you'd think there'd be 3 or 7 people that would contact us supporting Chairman Pai's direction. The number was actually 0, which I think says something. And it's frankly because not just my constituents, but I think Americans and residents of the entire world recognize that the internet has revolutionized the world. It really defines the digital age in so many ways. And we stand to lose that independent flow of information, including the job creation engine, unlike any that we've seen in the history of the United States, if we don't protect the principles of net neutrality. We now have some excellent panelists, and we're going to give each of them a 2 to 3 minute chance to say a few words. And then we're going to get to your questions and your comments, because this is really your opportunity to ask me or our expert panelists any questions that are on your mind about net neutrality. We've been doing a series of the digital roundtables on various topics. If you have a suggested topic, let us know. They're a great way that while I'm in session in Washington voting and representing you, we can also reach out and educate ourselves about issues that are important to Colorado and our country. We're joined by Nathan Schneider. And when I introduce you, if you could just raise your hand so our viewers at home can say who you are. Nathan is waving. He's a scholar in residence of media studies at the University of Colorado in Boulder. And he's a publisher of books on topics from cooperativism and the internet to the study of how God has been thought about from ancient Greece through the internet era. So a bit of a Renaissance man, and we're pleased to have you. Thank you, Nathan. We have Lee Mayer on our panel. She's the CEO and co-founder of Havenly, a Denver-based online interior design firm. So one of these small businesses that relies on a open internet. Matt Wood is Free Press, is an independent organization dedicated to saving the free and open internet. They're one of the premier advocacy organizations for the internet ecosystem, and they are working hard to curb media consolidation and ensure that diverse voices are represented in media. We're joined by Dan Moore of Food Corner. Dan is the first online marketplace for food businesses to connect with commercial food assets. He'll share insights on the implications that the end of net neutrality would have for small startup companies. Finally, we have Becky Boone. Becky is a freelance software engineer, like so many folks in Colorado, whose work enables nonprofits like Boulder Food Rescue to utilize technology more, and she'll be bringing it down to an individual level in terms of the impact. Nathan, we'll begin with you. If you can give us a 2 or 3 minute overview of the implications of the proposed rules to repeal net neutrality and any thoughts you'd like to share.
Well, thank you so much, Representative Polis, for taking on this subject, taking the time to really focus on it. I think of net neutrality, first of all, as a civil rights issue. It's about ensuring that we protect the openness of the internet, the way in which it allows many, many voices to be heard at a moment when companies are trying to steer it back toward the cable TV model. And it poses this question of whether your business or your organization, your nonprofit, your grassroots group could afford to set up its own cable channel. We're running into a danger of a kind of pay-to-play internet. And it's also a monopoly issue. At least 177 million Americans lack market protection from this net neutrality change, according to FCC data. What that means is that many Americans, about half or more, actually don't have a choice in their internet service provider, so they're at the mercy of whatever is offered to them. So this is really a problem of accountability, a challenge of accountability that is connected to broader questions about accountability across the internet economy. But this is an especially crucial one because this is the point at which we access the internet. This is like the railroads of 100 years ago that determined rural America's access to a broader economy, and we need to make sure to protect that access. One thing I want to note is some of our options if this rule passes in the FCC, or even if it doesn't, that there are actually opportunities to create more accountable business models for internet service providers. And Colorado lately has really become a leader in creating community-based internet service providers. Now, it's one of 20 states in the country that actually limit local authority to build municipal or cooperative networks, but in more than 100 jurisdictions in Colorado have opted out of that rule through referenda. And the latest big battle was in Fort Collins this last election, where CenturyLink and Comcast spent almost $1 million compared to $15,000 from the community groups in order to lose a fight over a ballot that enabled municipal internet to be provided there. Over in Delta Montrose, Rural Electric Cooperatives territory in the Western Slope, people in rural areas are getting faster, cheaper internet than I do in the tech hub in Boulder. And that's because their co-op, which is accountable to them, is providing internet. And that's just one of many stories. Also, Longmont has created a model of providing municipal internet. So regardless of what happens with this FCC rule, as important as these federal protections are, I think we also need to think about creating more accountable internet service provision, just as people in across rural America built their own electric system in the 1930s and 40s, and that has really shaped Colorado's economy as well. So we're really already taking a leadership role in this, and I think this is an opportunity for Colorado to continue to lead, regardless of what happens here, and to continue fighting for net neutrality on many fronts.
Thank you, Nathan. And as you know, I'm the representative of Fort Collins, and I'm very proud of Fort Collins residents who withstood the barrage of advertising in those campaigns and did something that frankly will help position Fort Collins as a consumer-friendly environment, a small business-friendly environment. And I think it's a great direction. I know other cities are looking at that model. Again, I would encourage you to type in your questions. You can do so on the Facebook comments bar or on the YouTube chat bar. Either way, we'll get to them when we're done with our panelists. We'll now go to Lee Mayer. Lee? You're muted, Lee. You need to unmute yourself before you talk. Sorry.
Of course. I do this all the time on conference calls too. Well, thank you all for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. From my perspective, it's often very hard to quantify a lot of the kind of policy things that go on and their direct impact on my business. But this is one that's fairly easy. So I'll talk about that for a second. But I think, one of the most interesting things is I run a startup. It's a tech startup. It's an online company. It's a consumer-facing online business. We're about 3 years in. And one of the beauties of our economy is anyone with an internet connection and a little bit of time and wherewithal can start something and grow it to become, hopefully a fantastic business. And that's kind of what I've always loved about it. I think the principle of a free, fair, and open, somewhat egalitarian internet is kind of the basis on which so much of the ecosystem around technology exists. Certainly how my company exists. We're small. We've got like 25 million in capital in. We're not by any means large enough to start to think about what it would take to maintain parity with far larger companies in as much as how we service our clients. And that means like I can't be significantly slower when my web page is served to our consumers. A really great sort of quantification is what we've noticed is for effectively every second over 2 seconds that it takes for our page to load to consumers, we lose about 7 percentage points in conversion. And that's pretty large. I mean, it's like very meaningful. I can quantify it for you, but let me tell you, it's a really big impact. And so for us to be able to sort of access the consumer in a fair and free way is pretty vital for us to continue to operate and serve kind of our large consumer population.
Thank you, Lee. I appreciate that perspective from your own, small company. Matt, we'll go over to you. Again, I want to welcome our new viewers. We're having a discussion of net neutrality with our experts in a digital roundtable. Feel free to post your comments on Facebook or on YouTube, where we are broadcasting live. We now go to Matt with Free Press. Matt?
Thank you so much, Congressman. It's a thrill to be here with all of you and all this great panel. I'm here in Washington, where the congressman is right now, and we are a nationwide, nonpartisan nonprofit that does a lot of communications and technology rights issues. We have about 1 million members nationwide who help to drive all of this energy, and all those who are opposing the current FCC's plan to take these rules away. I love going after Lee and Nathan because they set it up so well. Net neutrality is an economics issue for sure, and it's about fair markets and open markets. But it is also a civil rights issue. And we like to say here at my organization that it's a racial justice issue. It's about giving people a voice who have been marginalized and kept off of other platforms like cable TV, as Nathan was mentioning earlier. So net neutrality really is nothing more than the non-discrimination law of the internet. And that's why we think it's so vital that we retain it. There's nothing old-fashioned about non-discrimination law. There is nothing that says cable companies or phone companies will keep their promises to be good and refrain from blocking or throttling traffic when they see a financial benefit from doing so. And that is why we're so upset about the current FCC's plan to roll back the very strong rules that were put in place barely 2 years ago, I guess coming up on 3 now as we get to 2018, and to undo all of the great work and all of those vital protections kept in place by the previous administration. And thanks to the congressman's work and so many other great champions here in Washington, D.C. who've made this possible. So the current FCC is willing to throw all that away. They're going to say they will legalize blocking by your internet service provider. They will legalize throttling and slowing certain sites down, or maybe speeding others up in ways that Lee was describing she's not able to afford, all because they feel like that's going to be better for the internet ecosystem, and we feel like that is a tragedy. My organization has sued the FCC before on these rules, and the last time we wound up defending them because the previous regime got it right. So this is an issue where the fight is not over. It could go to Congress, and the congressman has talked about that and some of the things happening right now on the Hill to try and stop the bad decision at the FCC. It will almost certainly go to the courts again, too. And so, of course, we are waiting and working towards this vote at the FCC here on Thursday. But that is by no means the end of this conversation or the end of the fight to preserve these vital rights for every internet user everywhere.
Thank you, Matt, and thanks for your eloquent work on behalf of net neutrality and consumer protections. For those just joining us, I'm Jared Polis, hosting our digital roundtable around net neutrality, internet freedom. We have experts here from Colorado and across the nation, and we will get to your questions after 2 more presentations. Now we have Dan Moore of Food Corridor. Dan?
Thank you, Congressman Polis. Thanks for having me. So for the past 3 decades, the internet has transformed society. On the internet, bits are bits, no matter which sites send them. Websites all have the same access to the same consumers. This has led to an explosion of discussion and ideas like the world has never seen across all parts of the ideological spectrum. Since around 2005, the question of how and if to regulate the internet to ensure such access to information has preoccupied the FCC. Should the providers of internet services to consumers be regulated under Title I of the 1934 Communications Act as amended, or Title II? Given court decisions in 2010 and 2014 ruling the FCC has no ability to enforce network neutrality under Title I, the FCC could choose to abdicate regulation of free information access or change how ISPs were classified. In 2015, as Matt mentioned, ISPs were reclassified as common carriers so that Title II enforcement actions were available. The FCC specifically stated that only some Title II rules would apply. This action was opposed by ISPs for understandable reasons, who wants to be under more government regulation. However, democracy is about weighing hard choices, and I don't believe that broadband ISPs will be restrained by other proposed remedies such as increased competition or antitrust laws. This is why I support the efforts of Congressman Polis and others to prevent the upcoming action from the FCC. The benefits of maintaining a level playing field for all content providers on the internet outweigh the possible business impacts of additional regulation on ISPs. I'm a co-founder of a small software company, and outcomes like paying an ISP for faster access to our customers would severely impact our ability to innovate and serve those same customers. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Our final speaker, and we have several questions lined up. Thanks, sir. And you can, again, type your questions on Facebook or YouTube. We'll get to them in just a moment. Becky, our freelance software engineer, Becky Boone. Thank you for joining us, Becky.
Hi, Congressman Polis. I really appreciate that you are my representative. I just want to say that. I want to add a little bit of context for myself in the lens that I view net neutrality. I was actually born and raised in Indonesia and Saudi Arabia. So in Saudi Arabia, there was actually blocking, right, on the internet. So if I wanted to look something up like breast cancer, that would actually be blocked in Saudi Arabia. So this is something that I personally have already experienced. So that's kind of when I think about this being FCC versus FTC, right? The FCC can say no blocking, whereas if it's in the FTC's realm, they can't exactly say that. But anyway, when I think about that, and I think about some of the nonprofits that I serve as a freelance software engineer, like Boulder Food Rescue, right? That has, they deliver food that would be otherwise wasted by grocery stores that are it's perfectly good food that's being thrown out for various reasons, and it's delivered to low income and homeless people who need it. And they're self-organizing volunteers, and it happens online. So when I think about the possibility of those sites being blocked or slowed down, that really impacts an organization like that to motivate their volunteers. And so that's sort of the lens I look at it through.
Thank you, Becky, for that perspective. We go to Mike Holm has 2 questions. He says, many people are worried about ISPs throttling service or filtering content. Do you think competition will naturally mitigate that, or is it too hard to compete? And I'll probably go to Matt on this. And does the government currently have an inappropriate amount of power to censor or filter the internet under the current FCC regulations? That's certainly a concern I hear as well. Matt, can you address those 2 points?
Sure, happy to. So competition, as others have already said, is a great idea, and sometimes people have more than one choice of broadband providers. I think we said earlier, this is about monopoly. Many people don't have more than one choice. But I would also say that even if you do have a few choices, we don't want to let the ISPs supposedly innovate and experiment with who blocks the least. I think a lot about cell phone companies in this case. And even as the technology evolves, the internet's a marvel, and broadband is better than plain old telephone service in lots of ways. But even if you have 3 or 4 or 5 wireless carriers available to you, very few people would think those companies should compete on things like blocking or throttling. And so it's just really not the service we're buying from the internet service provider. We're buying access to the internet, and they shouldn't be picking and choosing where we go. So competition is great. It would be helpful. It's hard to get because it's a very expensive business to get into, but it also wouldn't solve all the problems or prevent these kinds of harms necessarily. And then, yeah, on the government question, yeah, this is really not about that. We've heard that kind of complaint. You know, this gives the control of the internet to the government. Far from it. What this really is, as I said, is a non-discrimination law that says nobody has that kind of control. So Comcast can't pick and choose. CenturyLink can't pick and choose. Neither can the FCC. There's really nothing in their laws or their regulations that would let them step into those shoes. And of course, if that were the case, we would oppose any such attempt to do that.
Thank you. Our next question is from Rachel. And Rachel asks, what are the implications of the FCC changes for the Colorado economy and tech talent and companies that are moving here to Colorado? And we'll go to some of our entrepreneurs, maybe Becky or Lee or Dan, if any of you want to take that.
Sure, I can certainly start. I think as mentioned, the rules and I think the future is ultimately unclear around sort of the changes in the law, in the rules around Title II. I think one of the things that everyone, and certainly I am concerned about, and when I talk to other folks that are running companies like ours, is just our ability to compete. Fundamentally, when you start a company, typically you are undercapitalized as it relates to other folks, sort of your Googles and Facebooks and certainly larger content providers. And, the basic principle around net neutrality allows for us to have somewhat of a level playing field, provided we have an interesting and unique business model that appeals to our customers, whoever they are. I think one of the things that is, difficult for us to contemplate is what it would mean from an economic perspective for smaller companies like ours to compete for, sort of the eyeballs around, were these rules to change. And that has, I think, Congressman, you can probably tell us more about how important the tech ecosystem is to the Colorado economy. But, all of this vibrant activity, if you guys go to, some of the startup weeks, or you come visit some of our startups, or you see some of the things that are going on, this vibrancy is really due to, I think, us as entrepreneurs figuring out a way to serve our customers and not being hindered unnecessarily just because of our relatively small size. And I think, kind of pulling the plug on that or putting another sort of obstacle. I mean, I can't tell you, starting a company from scratch, as many of the entrepreneurs will tell you, it's like blood, sweat, and tears. I mean, it's hard. Putting something else in front of me that basically either means it's going to be far more costly to do business in a sort of an equal way to larger competitors, or I won't fundamentally be able to do business as well as my other competitors, effectively puts a hurdle that is extraordinarily high in front of our, small entrepreneurs. And I just would hate to see, all of this, again, all of this excitement and vibrancy and capital and growth and employment that is happening in the tech sector due to, many of these small companies grow a little bit bigger. I think that would just be a shame, not just for Colorado, I think in any sort of growing tech ecosystem.
Do any of our others want to get in with a quick word on the impacts on the economy before we get to the next question?
I just want to chime in real quick. You said that beautifully, Lee. I just think that you need to really worry about chilling effects. And as Lee said, it's hard enough to start any business. Adding more obstacles, especially for a business that is as low barrier to entry as it is for a software company right now, adding more of those barriers will definitely negatively affect the economy. And I think you'll see people that'll just, instead of becoming an entrepreneur, they'll just take the safe job at the large tech company, and we'll see a chilling effect on innovation in general.
Thank you. The next two questions, Laura Cole-Spitzer asks, doesn't this squelch freedom of speech and the pursuit of happiness? And I'll go to you, Nathan. Are we no longer in control of that pursuit? And another similar question, Nathan, when the FCC chairman forces this through despite overwhelming opinion, what are our options, or how can it change? So how do you see this as consistent with kind of our freedom of speech and pursuit of happiness, and what can be done? And on the what can be done part, we'll also go back to Matt.
Thank you. I think freedom of speech is a principle that whose meaning has evolved with our capacities to speak. As technology has evolved and created opportunities, new opportunities for discourse, the meaning of freedom of speech evolves. And I think over the last few decades, we've experienced a tremendous flowering of what freedom of speech can mean, where more and more people find more and more means through the internet to talk to each other, to have open conversations. And we've come to experience this openness as the part of the meaning of free speech. And I think everybody kind of recognizes that intuitively, and that's why this issue of net neutrality is so popular. It's something that so many people care about, because we have come to associate the capacity that the internet offers us with our right to free speech, and rightly so. Our options going forward, if this rule is changed, again, are, I think, first of all, to turn to Congress and see whether we can leverage Congress to pass strong regulations. I think it's also very important to be very wary of the kinds of talk that the big internet service providers are offering, and saying that they're claiming that they're supporting net neutrality in certain ways. It's really important that we pursue really strong protections like the current FCC rule. And then the other piece, as I mentioned, is to ensure that our ISPs are accountable to us. Nextlight, the fiber network in Longmont, a municipal internet service provider, has come out and said very explicitly, that they have no interest in changing their practice of net neutrality, because they're accountable to residents of Longmont who care about that. Right. Unfortunately, the dominant internet service providers are accountable mainly to shareholders who are seeking short-term profits, which in a monopoly environment that's not regulated can be very troubling. So if we don't have internet service providers that we can trust, we need to make sure that we create them. And part of that means pursuing federal rules and legislation that creates an environment in which there's a level playing field for these kinds of community-based internet service providers. Currently, a lot of the rules, unfortunately, are really oriented around supporting these private investor-driven companies rather than community options. These community options have been actively suppressed for a number of years now, and it's time that people wake up to that and start changing the environment, as many jurisdictions in Colorado have already been doing.
Thank you, Matt. And if you can add to that, Nathan talked about Longmont and Fort Collins. Scott asks, why should we take this sky is falling propaganda seriously when Longmont and Fort Collins have shown the best way to deal with Comcast or AT&T messing with their customers' bandwidth if they just start a city-owned ISP? Isn't this just a wake-up call to municipalities, perhaps even states, that there are public ways around this?
Well, there are public methods to get around it. Those are hard to start and hard to finance too. So we love municipally owned and cooperatively owned broadband alternatives. It's going to take a long time to catch up to the 50 and 100-year head start that cable and phone companies have when it comes to wiring the whole country and delivering an option that is a real competitor to their services. On the what's next, it's not. I don't say the sky is falling. With all due respect to the person asking the question, this is a loss of fundamental rights, and that's why we frame it as the court battle that is to come. We plan to take the FCC to court if they do this. We've always had these kinds of rules in place at the FCC, and I think we always should. It's really the first time that any FCC chairman is trying to abandon that responsibility altogether. And that's why we think we have a strong legal case, even though the ground has shifted over time. This is the first time they're really looking to get out of the business in the first place. On Congress, there's a key role to play for sure. And you talked about some of those ways. Really, we're looking to Congress to stop the FCC either before they vote or after the vote happens with various mechanisms to disapprove of agency actions. We're not particularly happy to look towards new legislation to rewrite these rules because we think, A, we have a good law in place today, and B, Free Press is a nonpartisan organization. Net neutrality is a nonpartisan issue everywhere, but maybe inside the Beltway. But with all due respect to Mr. Ryan and Mr. McConnell, I don't think anybody's really looking to this Congress to fix a lot of issues and do it well. And so, as Nathan was mentioning, we see the prospect of a watered down version of net neutrality maybe being all that could move through this Congress, at least in the immediate and near term.
Thank you. And, one of our viewers asked a counter, kind of the counter argument, and I'll give it over to Nathan to address and anybody else. Ironically, it's a question that, on the side against net neutrality, but it is from a bogus name. It's from somebody called Boulder Kibbles, which maybe that's a real person, but it doesn't sound real. Over half of North American internet traffic is Netflix and YouTube, neither of which pays anything to network providers. Wouldn't a per bit cost be a fair way to compensate the network providers without any risk of content-based restrictions? Can somebody address, isn't that a fair way to compensate the network providers? Let's go to Nathan and anybody else who wants to address it.
I think the key question here is what the internet looks like and what it means to get into the internet service business. And, I think there are questions to ask about, accountability questions and fairness questions among some of the companies that are at work on the internet. But I think this is a second question to ask. This comes after the fundamental question of how is the internet structured? Is it open or is it a set of variable lanes? If you start charging Netflix and YouTube, say, you're going to probably also start charging the video startup that is using some of the same technology, but is much smaller and has a chance to challenge some of those players. And actually, I think the danger here is that by setting up these kinds of fast lane models that these companies are trying to set up, they're actually going to instantiate a kind of permanence for those large companies and create a kind of symbiotic relationship where we're stuck with them and we have a less competitive environment. So while I recognize that there's a challenge there, I think the context upon which we want to work with that challenge is one of openness rather than a playing field in which those big players are kind of more established and more unshakable in their position.
Anybody else want to address this issue of compensating the broadband providers?
I'd like to for a second. I mean, I think we often hear this free shipping analogy. What would be wrong with having Netflix pay? The problem with that is, for one thing, Netflix and everybody, as the small business owners and startups could attest, they are paying for their connectivity. They have to get online in the first place. So that's important to note. The question here is, should they also pay for your connection at home? And we could think about models like that, but you are paying for your connection. So really what the ISPs of the world are looking for is to be paid twice for the same connection. And we just don't have that model. Think about the electric system. Maybe we could say, hey, General Electric, you should pay for my refrigerator because that draws a lot of power. That's actually kind of a fun academic exercise. It's just not the world we have today. And the last thing we need is the ISP being paid twice. So it's not free shipping. It's really double charging that they're after when they talk like that.
Thank you. Beverly Cortez has two questions. First, if the FCC continues to restrict our ability to succeed as an American citizen, is there any argument that it's against our constitutional rights? She also asked, if this were pushed through, could we implement certain rules with it that would be focused on not blocking, throttling, or having companies agree to those provisions? I'll add to that Doug Jenneman's question, what legislative options do we have and how likely are they that they would pass? And Matt, will go to you on all of those things. They're all kind of these process-oriented questions, but maybe you can also address the constitutional.
Yeah, I mean, the Constitution and the First Amendment, we often talk about net neutrality as the First Amendment of the internet. I think that's a real valid comparison, but of course, the constitutional protections don't apply to private companies. So we think it's important that people have these protections to be able to speak freely. But it's not as if the First Amendment applies directly to Comcast or AT&T or Verizon or Facebook or Twitter for that matter. On the question of legislation, I just kind of got there a second ago. Yes, Congress could act to enshrine these principles into law. We think they actually already did that. And I always kind of chuckle when people say we need a bipartisan law and solution here. The 1996 Telecom Act revised the Communications Act. I think it was Dan who was talking about that history earlier. And that passed in the House by a score of 414 to 16 or something in that neighborhood. Passed in the Senate 91-5. So we actually have had agreement on this, and it's really been the cable and phone companies who've litigated it to death over the years. So passing a new law is hard to do, and it doesn't actually solve everything if people keep suing. And those are among the many reasons that we don't think we can really get to a great compromise here in the near term in Congress.
Thank you. I do want to apologize to Boulder Kimballs, who indicated that is his or her real name, so I apologize for that. It's just, as you know, there were a lot of remarks that were done under other names. So I want to let you know, I'm sorry for that. A YouTube commentator, Fod Tai, says, perhaps Boulder could create a public ISP. What about a pilot project like there's been via Google and Facebook doing satellite internet service provision in developing countries? My question is more for our companies here. Do any of you have experience working with or using any public utility type internet access that anybody has provided? I don't know if we have anybody from cities that have it. Or perhaps, Nathan, you can speak to that phenomena nationally in terms of what you've seen in terms of the impact of municipalities and others that are underway in providing these opportunities.
Yeah, absolutely. For anybody who wants to learn more, I really recommend looking at the work of an organization called the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. They've been following Colorado's developments as well as developments around the country and have done some really great research exploring some of the impacts of these municipal and cooperative options. But on the whole, their work has been very convincing in demonstrating the economic development power of these kinds of models. Chattanooga, Tennessee is a really shining example of that. For instance, how a municipal high-speed internet system has been really impactful in creating a vibrant local economy. And I think this kind of approach, if you're going to do the local thing, is going to be more helpful in the long run than turning to companies like Google and others to do it for you, because depending on the terms, it could end up as kind of an extractive arrangement where the bargaining power of that company overwhelms the bargaining power of the city. And so I think it's really important to make sure that the constituents are really in charge of the terms on which they access their service.
And if I could just jump in here real quick and say that both Boulder, the city of Boulder in 2018 is exploring broadband options, and Boulder County, we just passed a measure in November looking into administrating broadband in the county.
And so it sounds like a lot of these are new efforts that will be coming online soon. Would any of our small businesses, Dan or Lee or Becky, talk about your own experience in finding providers in making your product or services available over the internet? What were your experiences, and what do you worry about changing without net neutrality protections in place? Dan, is that you? Go ahead.
Sure. So, I mean, from my perspective, as Matt said, I think that if this rule goes forward, there will be litigation and there'll be more confusion from the ISPs. And so, like, short term, I don't see tremendous change happening right away. I see ISPs and consumers continue to be confused and bothered by this issue. Long term, I fear more of the frog in the boiling pot of water issue, where slowly, bit by bit, the ISPs will be pressured by their shareholders and will start to implement things that would be anti-competitive. And we just won't have the ability as small businesses to step into the arrangements that other bigger companies will have. But a lot of that's based on supposition, and I don't have anything concrete to point to right now.
Thank you. And I want to go back to Nathan. Would the repeal of net neutrality also be a barrier for political participation? For instance, people may not be able to access or might have their selective access controlled to discussions, even discussions like this. Nathan, can you address that concern of the importance of net neutrality in a democracy and civil society?
Yeah, I think that's a really vital question. You know, I think in the past few years, we've seen some signs about what this could look like. You know, one example, for instance, is the way Facebook has been delivering free internet to countries and regions around the world where internet's not readily available. And what they've created is essentially a kind of vision of what a post-net neutrality world looks like, one in which people get service for a lower rate or free than they might now, but they can only access certain parts. So for instance, in that case, Facebook and a few other companies that are paying Facebook for the privilege of being accessible. And, you know, in the last election cycle, or the 2016 election cycle, we saw very, very clearly how dependence on platforms like Facebook and others, dependence on a very narrow range of platforms has enabled a kind of manipulation of the political process that's very dangerous. And I think rather than and I think that losing net neutrality would be a step in the wrong direction in that respect, and would steer us even more toward manipulable systems rather than an internet that gives us as citizens more freedom of choice in where we get our information.
Thank you. A couple points here. So Dalton asks, it seems like the decision being made is being made internally by the FCC without any input from constituents or lawmakers. What are the courses of action for trying to stop net neutrality repeal, considering how it seems like the FCC is doing this anyway? And then another question from Pod Thai says, for Becky, who lived in Saudi Arabia and cited shutoffs of services, what are possible implications to the low-income and homeless communities in the United States? So what, you know, if they're doing this anyway, what's next? And what are the implications to homeless communities and low-income communities? Let's start with you, Becky.
I'm not sure I can really wrap my mind around that question. Not being homeless myself, I'm not sure I can really speak to that impact. But as far as, yeah, I have to sit on that one for a minute.
I don't know, they directed it to you, but the other part of the question was, again, what, you know, when we have kind of these economic drivers? And what is the next step, given that the FCC seems internally to be doing this anyway? Maybe, Matt, you can talk about what Congress can do. Another viewer, Kelsey, recently saw that I sponsored HR 4585, Save Net Neutrality Act. I know we're talking about a congressional resolution of disapproval as well. But Matt, maybe you can talk about some of those tools that we might have if there were a majority of Congress that wanted to, and of course leadership that let us vote on it.
Right. Yeah, I mean, the FCC process, a lot of people have talked to them. There have been allegations of fraudulent and fake comments, speaking of manipulated totals. But if we look at the full total in the FCC, they've heard from at least 23 million people online, and others talking to them in other public fora, although those have been limited. That's why we've turned to Congress. Poll after poll, including one that came out today, shows that it doesn't matter. Democrats, Republicans, Independents, even Trump's 3-to-1 or 4-to-1 support keeping these rules in place. And then, as you said, Congressman, when people actually take action and pick up the phone, it's almost unanimous. Almost nobody is willing to say, get rid of these protections. We want the cable company to choose for us.
Well, literally nobody. I mean, I've never experienced that, but I mean, I'm sure I have some constituent somewhere that wants these removed, but they haven't called me.
Right, and so we've gone to Congress because you have power to influence the FCC. The FCC is a creature of Congress, and there are ways to do it formally and ways to do it informally. But it seems, unfortunately, like despite all of that overwhelming popular opinion flowing in the other direction, the 3 Republican commissioners at the FCC have closed their ears to that and not been willing to listen.
So Karen Pellegrin asked, a question to me, Congressman Polis, how are you engaging your fellow colleagues in Congress in protecting net neutrality, and do you feel you're finding success with those colleagues in supporting net neutrality? It goes back to something that Matt mentioned. Only in Washington is this a partisan issue. For whatever reason, because it truly has nothing to do with, that I can tell, with ideology or anything else, Democrats are, I think to a person, for net neutrality. Republicans, with hardly any exceptions, have attacked and want to repeal net neutrality. Maybe it's because it was President Obama's appointee who proposed it. Maybe it's because they don't understand it. But we are having difficulty making progress with Republican leaders. It doesn't mean Republican business leaders aren't for net neutrality. My Republican constituents are for it. But there seems to be a breakdown there. I'm certainly making the case member to member. I talk to members on the floor and elsewhere about the importance of this to jobs, to the economy. Many Republicans want to be pro-business. This is a great way to be pro-business. How did we kind of get here, Matt, and why in the Capitol does it seem partisan, and what else should a member of Congress like me be doing to try to get the institution of Congress to push back?
Yeah, it's a good question. How do we get here? I think it really is a lot of lobbying money, and any big company is going to play both sides of that and talk to Democrats and Republicans. It's just a mixture of the ideology and the pitch they've made. This was mentioned earlier, but oftentimes the Title II legal framework is described by cable and phone companies as burdensome or heavy-handed. And in fact, we've had this framework in place for wireless voice services and business broadband services for 2 decades now, and it hasn't been heavy-handed. In fact, it's been a smashing success. My organization has studied that too. There are claims that investment has gone down, and in fact, that hasn't been true. Broadband investment is doing just fine. They're making money. They're deploying faster speeds, maybe not as fast as we would like, but it's that kind of ideological notion that somehow regulation is always bad, when in fact, common sense regulations like these can level the playing field and keep the system open. Startups and entrepreneurs and tech people that we have on this call. One quick note, the Republican Party has not been a monolith on this, and just today, in fact, right around noon Mountain Time, right there in your home state, Mr. Kaufman came out with the strongest statement we've seen yet from a Republican. He said, I think Congress should speak to this issue, or we might have some minor disagreements with him about that right now. But he clearly said, Chairman Pai at the FCC, please stop. Don't repeal these rules now. Give us in Congress time to talk about it and think about it. And that's a very welcome message coming from a Republican member of Congress who I think has heard from a ton of constituents too, and gets that this is really not a partisan issue anywhere but here in the halls of Congress and a few places in DC.
Yeah, thank you. And I think the political challenge is, even if we get to a point as we are in so many issues where 20 or 30 or 40 Republicans, agree with us on something like net neutrality in the House of Representatives, how do we get Republican leadership, which seems intent on gutting net neutrality, to allow a vote on it, to allow a bill to move forward, to take on something that seems to be part of President Trump's agenda, whether President Trump is deliberately pursuing it or just delegating completely to Chairman Pai. So it's a question of how we get there politically. Stephen Young asks, what should we do if net neutrality laws, the rules are repealed? What are the next steps for citizens? And maybe let's try to go to see if some of our small businesses like Lee or Dan or Becky want to come in. What will you do next if this is repealed, this protection? Lee?
I can certainly take a stab at it. So I think, if this is indeed repealed, I think it sort of behooves us to do one of two things. So first, as the congressman and many other folks have mentioned, I think it's highly important, I think, to figure out a way to potentially provide some safeguards through either congressional action or other sort of political action that ultimately, hopefully, protects, I think, a constituent that's important to, I'd imagine, both sides of the aisle. So small businesses like ours. I think secondarily, there's certainly things that I would start to need to understand. So first, what would it mean specifically for me as a business? Would that mean I cannot reach my consumer? Would that mean I no longer can effectively reach my consumer? Would it mean I need to pay certain sums of money to reach my consumer? And I think ultimately figure out a way to, both from a business perspective, but also from a policy perspective, galvanize enough folks together to ensure that these monopolies in question, your ISPs, are doing the right things by us business owners. So certainly, I would imagine that public pressure on a Verizon or a Comcast is certainly not as influential as large sums of money. But I think together, potentially, there is a way to ensure that they, again, do all the right things by small businesses. I certainly hope it won't get there. I hope that, again, if the FCC does vote to move in a different direction, that we are able to, despite all of the things that I think the congressman has mentioned, able to provide some protection through the congressional process. But again, I think public pressure works. These are public companies. They're investor driven, and certainly with enough, I think, hopefully force of voice amongst small businesses, I certainly hope that we're able to sort of resist, I think, the worst possible scenario, which is not just sort of the economic implications, but a lot of the civil rights implications that have been brought up today.
Good, and let me frame that also for Dan and for Becky. Paying more for faster internet services would affect all businesses, but would have a particular negative impact on small and growing business. As business owners or freelancers, Dan and Becky, can you speak to the importance of a reliable internet for a reliable fee has on your ability to serve your customers? Becky?
Yeah, so I just kind of think back to my mom when we lived in Saudi Arabia. She was in IT, and her solution to blocking things was to VPN to a server in the US that allowed her that access she was missing. So I can imagine trying to get the word out about all kinds of workarounds that creative people will come up with as a response to that. But thinking about how it impacts volunteers, maybe doing workarounds like around texting, like moving away from the way we currently organize our volunteers when I think of something like Boulder Food Rescue. And then lastly, just getting involved on the local level, giving feedback to the city of Boulder or the county of Boulder around their works around doing their own broadband.
Okay, Dan?
So I just want to rephrase the question so I made sure I heard it right. You're saying the questioner was asking how important is competitive broadband access to my corporation or my company to serve my customers?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, and knowing, getting reliable access at a reliable rate, and knowing what it'll be.
Yeah, I mean, I can't think of a single factor that's more important for our business than reliable internet access. I would give up our office, I would give up our phone lines. Um, and frankly, there are a large number of applications that are built on this free and open internet that we could not run our business without. So I can't think of anything more important than maybe our customers, I guess, are more important. But other than that, the internet and access to the internet is the most important thing for our business.
Good. And I want to say, well, we're going to be closing in just a minute. Thank you for joining our digital roundtable on net neutrality. Are there any of our experts that anything else you wanted to add or wanted to say to get in before we complete and I give my final remarks? Go ahead, Dan.
I just want to say one thing. I know that we've talked and Matt has mentioned that Congress has provided adequate regulation for this, that we don't need to go back to Congress. I feel like the litigation that's happened over the last 15 years and the back and forth, I would love to see this settled by an act of Congress, at least so we can all put this to bed and the rules of the road are very clear. That would be my desire as a small business owner, make things certain.
Thank you, Dan. You know, and is that Matt, are you looking to chat as well? You're off of mute, Matt.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. I mean, yeah, I just, no disagreeing with Dan, that would be great. I just think when I'm a lawyer, so when new laws pass, oftentimes that's described as full employment act for lawyers. So it's hard to get to that sweet spot, but if we can get there, that's great. We just have our skepticism about the willingness of some of the members of Congress now, and then also a lot of the lobbies who are in play here, and not just even the ISPs. I mean, the big tech companies are important, but they're not going to have all the same interests as all of our great small business owners here. So that's why we worry about that situation, but not because we're opposed in the abstract to laws that get this right.
Yeah, I think this unique confluence, and perhaps the reason that I've gotten overwhelming contacts for net neutrality is removing net neutrality protections is bad for consumers, which is almost everybody, and it's bad for small businesses and entrepreneurs, which are almost everybody else. Even if you view the world through that lens rather than the lens as a consumer, it makes it harder to succeed and get ahead as a small business and create jobs. So that's why I'm doing everything I can as a legislator. I've published on this, written extensively during the original rulemaking process, the first round of the rulemaking process, now, of course, during the public input process, and to Chairman Pai most recently to try to encourage at least a delay in these actions. We will also look at the various ways that we can address this in Congress. I'm talking regularly and will continue to with my Democratic and Republican colleagues about how we can get a majority of Congress to push back, which is what matters at the end of the day. I've certainly written, other members have written, but it's a minority of Congress doesn't control anything. It takes Congress acting, and we have some work in that regard. And that work is certainly helped along by good information, which Nathan and Lee and Matt and Dan and Becky have provided us here tonight. And I want to thank my constituents for their excellent questions on net neutrality. We can certainly try to respond to some online after this conference of this digital roundtable as well. But I want to thank you so much for joining our digital roundtable, and I wish you all a terrific evening.